What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I am going to be bringing you part 5 of my Middle-earth review series. Now, today I am going to be talking about The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, the second installment in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the penultimate film in this epic 6-movie Middle-earth series. Now, I love this film, and many people view this as the weakest of the trilogy, surprisingly, and I wholeheartedly disagree. I think this is far better than the first film, and it's still one of my favorite movies of all time. And the main kind of complaint lobbed at it is that it's the middle chapter. And I feel like being the middle chapter is often viewed as a negative thing, but I feel like this film uses that to its advantage. It's able to really focus in on the characters and build their personal relationships and motivations going into the third film, which is why Return of the King works so well. And I took a lot of notes while watching this film again, and I had very few negative kind of criticisms or negative notes, I suppose. The only things I could really think of were really grasping at straws, so I'll just list them off real quick here. There's an odd change from the source material by J.R.R. Tolkien, where in this film, Galadriel sends an army of elves to aid the men of Rohan in the Battle of Helm's Deep. And that did not occur in the book, and leading that army is this character, Haldir. And in the battle, there's this weirdly dramatic moment where he dies, and they play it up as this really kind of dramatic beat, which feels kind of weird because they're trying to make you feel emotional for a character that they really didn't bother to give you any investment in. And I feel like Peter Jackson just wanted to make the audience feel like there was real kind of stakes and there were real consequences, because at this point in the story, none of the main characters could really die. And I can kind of understand that. It's not a bad scene. Like, as Haldir is dying, he sees all the bodies of his fallen comrades, and that's definitely some World War imagery, because Tolkien wrote this, shortly after the First World War, and he was in the First World War, and he saw a lot of traumatic things. So that's kind of some World War I imagery, as well as how in the trenches and in the war on the battlefield, shell craters would fill with water and the bodies would float to the top, and that's what the dead marshes is meant to show when Frodo, Gollum, and Sam are going through the dead marshes and they see the bodies. So there's a lot of, this is where the war influence really comes through, and it's even more so amplified in the third film with Mordor, but this is where the World War influences really start to show through. And I'm getting into too many positive things. I need to get back to my negative things. This is kind of a small thing. It's not even really a bad thing. It's just kind of a funny thing that I've always noticed, is that throughout the entire Battle of Helm's Deep, the Uruk-hai have these giant spears, and people are constantly either jumping on them or running into them, and miraculously no one gets impaled or stabbed. It's just something funny and amusing. It's not really a bad thing, though. It's really grasping at straws once again. And one more thing that isn't really negative, but it's just kind of a small thing, is that the scenes that were cut from the theatrical release, as opposed to the extended release, really do kind of feel like they were the least important in this film of all three. Like, the scenes that they cut from the theatrical cut are justified. Particularly in the first disc. If you didn't know, the extended versions of the Lord of the Rings films are split into 2 discs, so they're basically like 2-parters almost. And especially in the first disc, there are very few scenes that I would regard as being necessity. In the second disc, though, there are quite a few scenes that I would regard as being important, and I find weird that they cut out of the theatrical cut. But as opposed to how many of those scenes that I'm just like, why did you cut that out, that are in the first and third films, this film has the least of those. That's basically about it in regards to negatives or kind of, mixed aspects. Like, this film, I think, is near perfection. So let's get into the good stuff. The first thing I want to bring up is how the title for this film actually is kind of the most thought-provoking title. The first and third films have pretty obvious titles and what they imply. This goes for the books as well. Okay, Fellowship of the Ring. It's pretty obvious what that's referring to. Return of the King. Also pretty obvious what it's referring to. But with The Two Towers, there's a lot of different perceptions you can have of that title. The obvious answer would be that it refers to Barad-dûr and Orthanc, and the Two Towers are represented by the 2 factions of evil, Saruman and Sauron. But you could also be referring to the kings, the leaders of these armies, like Aragorn and Sauron. It could also be referring to the 2 wizards, Gandalf and Saruman. It could also be referring to the 2 kingdoms, Rohan and Gondor. there's a lot of different perceptions that can be had about that title, and I think it's cool how it's the most thought-provoking title of all three. And then also, we just have so many fun and interesting characters introduced in this film. It really widens the cast. First up is, Grima Wormtongue, who's just kind of the gross, evil underling of Saruman, and I think he's just a fun little character. He's pretty one-dimensional, but I think he's how you do that type of character right. He's just this disgusting, slimy, evil guy that you just kind of love to hate, and he's not overbearing or irritating. I feel they tried to kind of copy that character with Alfred in The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, and it just didn't work, and it fell flat. I feel like this is how you do kind of the evil underling character right. I feel like they did a really good job with him. And then this is where Gollum really gets most of the screen time, or more screen time than the first one, because in the first one he was just kind of in the background and he didn't have any lines, but here you get to see him interact with the characters, and Andy Serkis does a phenomenal job, and the effects for him still hold up just magnificently. It's crazy to look at and compare and contrast, because motion capture didn't exist when they made this film. So just looking at the scenes with him and just looking at him next to these real people, I never questioned it. He just looks so legitimate, and he's just also a fascinating character, and they captured the multifaceted nature of his character really well with the split personalities and the scenes where the two sides of him, Smeagol and Gollum, are arguing over what the best course of action should be. And he captures everything. He's not truly villainous, he's sympathetic in many regards, and he shows empathy, but he's also just corrupted, and he shows so many layers, and they captured his character really well. I just can't go talking about this movie without mentioning his character. And then also you just have, King Theoden, the King of Rohan, who's just an honorable guy, but who ultimately feels a little bit cold to other people. But that's just because his primary motivation is to protect his people, to preserve his generation, to preserve the life of his people. But that does make him a little bit kind of, negligent to trust other people. He's distrusting of other people. He doesn't trust Gondor, and it makes him seem a little bit cold, but he is a very interesting character and very different. That's something that I want to really specify, is that the cast is so diverse in the characters and their motives and what drives them. They're all very different and diverse, and I really appreciate that. Then we have Eowyn, the niece of Theoden, and she's really interesting and represents kind of the restrictions that were placed upon women at the time. She wants to fight, and she wants to prove herself to not just be, just restricted to the role that common women had at the time, but she wants to prove herself as, a warrior. She wants to fight with the men, and they just won't allow her to. And, a lot of people complain about kind of the love triangle, I suppose, even though I don't feel like that should be classified as that, because a love triangle would be to imply that she and Eowyn or Arwen come into conflict over Aragorn, but that never happens. They never meet, so I don't think it's really a love triangle, and I feel like it's very realistic in a sense, because she gravitates towards Aragorn because he is the one person that kind of shows empathy towards her plight, and he understands her. And I think that's very realistic, because oftentimes in life, if someone shows belief in you when everyone else is kind of putting you down, obviously you are going to gravitate towards that person, and I feel like it's actually very realistic. She's a really great and interesting character, and that only continues into The Return of the King, but we'll talk about that later. And then we have Theramir, the brother of Boromir, and he is also another great and fantastic character, because he's in a way even more real than Boromir was. You see in this flashback, which was cut out of the theatrical release for whatever reason, that he and Boromir were close, and that even Boromir didn't like their father, and you get to see their father even before The Return of the King in the extended cut of The Two Towers, and you see just how horrible he is, and how, just dismissive he is of Faramir, and how much he just despises him, and you feel super bad for this guy. So when he has the ring within his grasp, you understand why he wants to take it, because while Boromir wanted to use the ring as a tool, to fight off evil and protect his own people, Theramir wants it for just a far more personal reason, because he just wants to be loved by his father. He feels neglected and hated, and you feel terrible for him. And you have this whole arc that is present with his character that it is not present at all in the theatrical version, where you have his father say in the past, I will never let you have the chance to prove yourself. And, when he sees the ring, he says, this is my chance to prove myself. But then at the end, Sam says to him, you proved yourself today. You are of the highest ilk. And that's really powerful because, you have Galadriel say to Elrond earlier in the film, the captain of Gondor has to but extend his hand, accept the ring, or take it, and the world will fall. But in a way, they have kind of imagery that reinforces him pushing away the ring. He shoots the Nazgul that's about to take the ring from Frodo, and they are ring wraiths, so they're kind of the embodiment of the ring in a way. So that's him in a way kind of pushing away the ring. And I think that's really well done. I think he's such an understandable character, and he understands in the end, he realizes that in order to prove himself, he doesn't have to have all the power. He just has to make the right decision. And I think he's a great character and has way more of an arc in the extended cut than in the theatrical release. And I do not understand why on earth they cut out the scenes with him from the extended cut. And then I do want to be fair and kind of take back something I said in the first video, which is that I really complained about Elijah Wood and said he was poor casting. I still stand by that, and I think in this film he is still a pretty annoying character in the regard that he's just really cowardly. But Elijah Wood is far better in this film. He is still very wooden at points, but he does show far more emotion in this film, and I like that they show him being compassionate towards Gollum, but with that compassion ultimately being misplaced. And they make you think about whether or not that's actually him showing compassion or whether it's the ring forcing him to feel compassion, because Gollum is the only other one there who has experienced the burden of the ring. So his compassion is misplaced. It's understandable why he shows compassion towards Gollum, but he kind of starts to become cold towards Sam, his best friend, and Sam is the voice of reason. So it's really interesting. They actually do a very good job with his character in this film, and I do want to take back what I said in my first video, and I suppose apologize to Elijah Wood a little bit, because he's far better in this film than in the first one. I think it's just really Return of the King where his character becomes unbearable. But we'll wait and see. Maybe when I rewatch it, I'll like him. Maybe I'll just have to take back everything I said about Bilbo. Or Frodo. I'll take back what I said at the gate, But yeah, Frodo is far better in this film than the first one, or at least Elijah Wood's performance is. And, Gandalf coming back from the dead is another kind of often criticized element, and it's become a bit of a cliche at this point with, the old mentor characters kind of dying and coming back. But you have to consider the time when Tolkien wrote it, and that Peter Jackson is simply adapting that original story. And, that's where kind of the Christian influence comes through, because I do believe Tolkien himself was a Christian, and you have that imagery of Gandalf and the Balrog falling, Balrog basically being this demon-type creature. He falls off the bridge of Khazad-dûm almost like Jesus pinned to the cross, and then when he comes back, he's Gandalf the White, almost like this angelic figure, just like Jesus, rising from the dead. So there is that Christian influence there, very obviously on display, and it's understandable why his character has a lot less personality than when he is Gandalf the Grey. But I've just always preferred Gandalf the Grey. He has far more charisma and personality than he does as Gandalf the White. His personality just gets stripped away, basically, and it's kind of weird. He's like, Gandalf the Grey, that's what they used to call me. It's like he's acting like he's forgotten who he was, but yet he still went and found Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, so obviously he knows them. Why is he acting like he doesn't know who he is? I always found that part weird. But it's understandable why the character has a lot less charisma, but I just personally prefer Gandalf the Grey. And it's just Gandalf the Grey was shown doing far more, badass things, like taking on the Balrog, taking out the Balrog even. And Gandalf the White gets his staff blown up by the Witch King of Angmar. It's really hard to think of, anything really cool that Gandalf the White does. I guess he drives away the orcs at the Battle of Pelennor Fields at Minas Tirith, but I can't really think of anything super awesome that he does. So yeah, it's kind of a personal thing, but I've just never been as big a fan of Gandalf the White as I am of Gandalf the Grey. And I also want to talk about the most often criticized element of this film, and that is the Ents. A lot of people dismiss the Ents, basically these talking tree people that Merry and Pippin spend a lot of their time with throughout the film, and I would have to disagree with people who complain about that element, because it's a very important element of Tolkien's story, and in the book, Tolkien wrote that on paper, and he never kind of considered that it would be adapted to screen or to be a film, right? So I understand how certain elements of that don't adapt super well, and how slow and methodical the scenes are with Treebeard and the Ents. But the juxtaposition of the Battle of Helm's Deep to the trees and how slow they are, it's intentional, because it's meant to show the gray area. The Ents don't really have an allegiance to either side. They don't really have an opinion on the war. So they're kind of that moral gray area, but they also represent, once they do join the fight, kind of the forces of nature fighting against evil. It shows how significant this conflict is, that not just the forces of humanity, but also the forces of nature are fighting against evil. That's even reinforced in the scene when Gandalf, or not Gandalf, when Aragorn calms down one of the horses in the stable in Edoras, and then later on in the film, after he's fallen into the river and he wakes up unconscious on a riverside, that horse is what wakes him up, saves him, and ultimately brings him back to Helm's Deep. And that's another kind of reinforcement of that idea of the forces of nature standing up to the forces of evil. The Ents do have an important focus. They have an important role in the story. They are a very important part of the story, and I'm glad Peter Jackson, gave them a lot of screen time. And I understand why people feel it interferes with the pacing, but I'm glad that he gave it the amount of attention he did, because they are a far more important part of the story than people give them credit for. And I just want to bring up how well balanced the tone is in this film in particular, on all these films. The humor is really well handled compared to something like the Marvel movies, where it's just bad jokes all the time. But here it's like the humor is well handled and it comes from the characters. You have characters like Gimli that are obviously designed for comic relief, and you have him and Legolas's kind of killing orcs competition where they're counting how many kills they get. It's pretty entertaining and fun, but it never interferes with the tone. It's consistent. These films are very dark, and they deal with a lot of dark themes. So when you have humorous moments, they're funny. Like when, Gandalf, or not Gandalf, why do I keep saying Gandalf? Gollum, when Gollum brings back a rabbit, and Sam wants to cook it, and Gollum just wants to eat it raw, and then you just have this cut, and Sam's cooking it, and Gollum just gives this horrible shriek, and he's really upset. There's just humorous moments that come from interactions between characters, and they're funny, and that's kind of the type of humor that I always prefer to just generic jokes being spewed all over the place. And, particularly Merry and Pippin as well really do grow in this film, particularly Merry, because Merry really starts to realize the severity of the conflict and is the driving force behind trying to convince the Ents to join the conflict and stand up to Saruman. And I feel like it's very important that Pippin is the one that convinces Treebeard to turn around and go back to Isengard. I always thought it was Merry. I forgot it was Pippin. I feel like that's very important because that starts to show Pippin's understanding of the severity of the conflict growing and how he kind of takes on the responsible role in the third film. Like, this film is very much Merry's movie, whereas The Return of the King is Pippin's movie. Like, this is where Merry steps up to the plate, and The Return of the King is where Pippin steps up to the plate. And I like that they kind of split that between these films, those characters growing. Because they were dragged into the adventure at the beginning without knowing the full kind of scale and importance of the quest. And I like how as the films go along, they progress and mature and step up to the plate, and I really like their element to the story as well. And the Battle of Helm's Deep is fantastic. I mean, so many people have said this, so I'm not going to really say anything else that hasn't been said by other people already, but the way they capture it visually with the thunder and lightning, the storm, and then with the wall blowing up, that was practically done with a model, I believe. And it's just really impressive, and it kind of structurally works really well. There's victories and losses, and, there are multiple points where the good guys kind of get a good push against the bad guys, and the reverse happens, and there's just good and bad reversals, and, it feels like a well-balanced battle. It never feels like any one side is doing better than the other throughout the entire fight, unlike Endgame, where it just seems like the freaking Avengers are on top of things all the time. There are times when you really do feel like the heroes are at a loss, but there's always that theme of hope, which leads us into Sam's speech at the end, which is all about hope and, the old stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. And the folks in those stories had every chance of turning back, only they didn't, because they were holding on to something. There's still some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. That's only like a quarter of the speech. It's a fantastic speech. It might be my favorite of all time. It might be the best of this series, because it really does apply to every story ever told. And everything about that is great. This film heavily deals with that concept and that theme of hope. And I think it's really well done and explored here. And with all that said, that's about all I have to say about The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. I think this film is extremely underrated. I mean, everyone still loves this movie, but I don't understand kind of the why this is labeled as being the weakest of this trilogy. I far prefer it to the first one, and I feel like it's a very important stepping stone and a very important part of the story, because being the middle of the story is an important part, and a lot of people seem to neglect that and forget about that, because it really does explore and deepen the characters, and even, the trees, the Ents being planted in the middle of the story. They're the middle. The trees are always the middle. Nature is the middle of everything. And it is intentional that they are in the middle chunk of the story. I don't know. It's just another little thing that popped into my head there. So I'm going to kind of end this off before I continue to ramble. But with all that said, that's about all I have to say about The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. It's a fantastic film, near perfection in my opinion, but it is not quite my favorite, and we will talk about that next time. You guys, please let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, and of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.